For Kenya as we look back at how we performed in 2014. First of all, how did you, receive the numbers presented today with regards to Kenya's growth rate? Are they a true picture, of what you saw as an economist in 2014? But most importantly, what were you keeping your tabs on?
Well, I think one of the things that surprised many people in the media, or the first reports that I saw, was that the growth rate was lower than what the target was. You remember towards when the budget was read last year, the growth rate was the forecast was about 6%. But this year's growth rate is even lower than the one we had in the election year. And that was expected. Of course, it's been explained in the report. In the report, one of the things they say was that rain, which once again confirms our vulnerability to shocks that come from the fact that when we have much less rain, then obviously it affects food and it affects production generally. And agriculture's contribution to GDP then is lowered. Yes. But because many Kenyans depend on agriculture, overall then we have what we did. So it's actually fallen. So the bigger debate should have been, we expected 6.3. It's 1% less, but it's explained largely by that.
So what were you keeping your tabs on today?
I think one of the things that I was watching out for were which sectors are driving growth. It's clear, as you can tell, a number of sectors grew at more than 10%. So we are talking here communications, we're talking communications, we're talking communications, construction. Yes. Which is still growing. So obviously, over what my rough calculation is that if you look at how much construction has grown over the last 3 years, on a compounded rate, it's close to 40%. Absolutely. Because it's been 11, 12, and 14. So that's really big if we put them together. So construction is still growing. Part of it, of course, from the private sector side, and the other is just the contribution that government is because of our infrastructure push, which is, I think, which is a good thing.
Were there any surprises for you, or are there things that we as Kenyans should question, in that report?
Not necessarily question, but some things are surprising. That the number of Kenyans taking passports is up, but the number of Kenyans taking IDs is down.
How do you explain that? What do you think is behind that?
I think what explains that was that in 2013, specifically, Kenyans needed to vote, and of course there's a big drive out there to ensure that many Kenyans were registered, so those were issued. So a number of people took up that, so the pent-up demand that had built for taking out IDs did not. Passports on the other side are just basically people, of course, with the world opening up and Kenyans seeking opportunities, but also business opportunities here and there. So many more Kenyans would demand ID. Or rather, the trend for IDs would be completely different from the one from for passports.
The election year, okay. Yeah. And of course I'm curious about that because, we know the Huduma centers were open, so, we would have expected a higher number of people applying for ID cards. Let's talk about devolution 2 years on. Yeah. Do you think it has had the economic impact expected?
Yes, if you look at the conference last week, most people who live, of course, there are teething problems here and there. Some of them are bigger than teething problems. But on the whole, Kenyans think the bold experiment that we took with devolution will pay off. I think Kenyans still have confidence that a lot can be made much better. But finally, I think the political fear that perhaps the national government wasn't as enthusiastic. If you read the president's statement together with that of the cabinet secretary for devolution, it's sure devolution is going ahead. I think there'll be no stopping it. We'll have bumps here and there, but we watch out for that. On the whole, devolution has done well in my view.
Now, despite the general economic slowdown, the number of people in employment actually increased to about 800,000. Yes. Very interesting to note that 82% of those 800,000 are in the informal sector. What do you read out of that?
Well, it tells you that when it comes to employment, we have a dual economy. We have those who work in formal sector, and we have those who work in the informal sector. And the informal sector is perhaps easier to enter, and it's usually a sinking our sink for those who cannot those who cannot be absorbed in the formal sector. So basically what happens is that's mostly agriculture, some kind of small-scale trade, and some and other trading activities that most Kenyans engage in, as they either wait or because they're in rural areas and they're not able to get that. So it's a trend we've had in Kenya for 20 years. It's a little worrying if you look at it over the long term, because it means the informal sector is still growing much faster than the formal sector. So for the purposes of collecting taxes, for instance, the equation is very complicated. How do you collect taxes from the informal sector? And it's showing you that for income taxes, the burden is disproportionately still on those who are in the formal sector.
Absolutely. And, you know, looking at the reverse, which is 18% of those 800,000 jobs, or slightly below 800,000 jobs, were created in the formal sector. And perhaps to get a sense of what you see 2015 being like in regards to employment, what numbers do you expect us to see?
Wow. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but what I'll tell you is that, yes, I still think that most of Kenya's jobs for the next, for the foreseeable future will come from the informal. Though, as we have infrastructure extended, both energy but also roads, we're talking about the rail and all that, the amount of people that will be required to actually work in those and activities that will come from that will mean that the formal sector may recover, and over time we'll see a good number. But for a long time, I think most of our jobs will continue to come from the informal sector.
All right, let's talk about inflation, which I know you've mentioned earlier, which rose to 6.9% in 2014 against the central bank safe zone of about 5%. Is the cost of living going to spiral higher? You know, we've got the benefit, or rather the perceived benefit of, you know, lower fuel prices. But is that really going to make a difference in 2015?
Well, it made a difference from December, I think, to February. But I think two things mean we need to be careful this year. One of those is that the Kenya shilling is getting weaker, and most of the imports of oil, which means that the advantage that we may get from cheaper oil will be offset by the fact that Kenya's shilling is depreciating. So that definitely will affect inflation overall. I think what surprised me, though, that was that, notwithstanding the fact that oil prices went down, the inflation for 2014 at 6.9 was still higher than what we had for the previous year. But I think it's because the benefits of cheaper petroleum did not kick in until November, and specifically December and January. Of course,
and then it kicked out.
Yes, then it kicked out again.
Almost already. And let's just stick on the matter of currency for a little bit. Is there something the central bank can do to cushion the shilling further? And I know we operate in an open market, but the Kenyan shilling has weakened to about, what, 94 shillings 50, which is the lowest it has been against the US dollar in the last 3 years. Is there anything that can be done going forward?
It's difficult to see what can be done in the immediate term. I think the causes of the Kenya shilling, and actually it's one of the things that still tells you, if you look at our imports compared to our exports, our exports grew by 6%, imports by I think 13%, 12.7 or thereabouts, according to the report. What that tells you is we are still importing more than we're exporting. That's not a bad thing on its own. So it has to show in the value of the shilling, because it means that our payments, we need to pay for many more things, and we're not paying for them off our exports. Because the exports are much less. So obviously, because we have that trade gap, and because we also have that payments, a lot of imports for infrastructure and also some machines, I think over time it has to show in pressure on the shilling. So that's the first. The second thing is, at the Institute of Economic Affairs, tracking the shilling over the last 5-6 years, we've thought that partly because of the pressure, part of it is political, on the central bank, the shilling has been far too strong given the fundamentals. So it's adjusting. I don't know how far it will go, but my view is that, I speak advisedly, but my view is that 95 shillings, 96 shillings is not necessarily a disaster. Why? Because it will favor our exports in terms of tea and coffee. And tea exports have grown, coffee exports actually have grown by a big amount than tea exports, which is both a good thing. So coffee farmers and those who export our agricultural products will have a better pay. And obviously it will also make our tourism, which also has been affected a little bit, will make our tourism product a little cheaper or more competitive, because the shilling will be cheaper compared to the dollar and other international currencies.
Kwame, as we wind up, given all these realities that we are grappling with, what can be done to jumpstart our economy, or take it into, you know, high acceleration mode that, you know, we all had for the last few years? Well,
two things. The first is, I think the infrastructure rollout has to continue. We have to pay for infrastructure the most cost-effective ways. I think not all of it is being paid for well. So that's the first. The second is we need a second round of liberalization. I think Kenya's private sector is very competent, and they have problems, to be honest. But we really need a second. Because if you look at and yesterday the president released a list of all those people, the number of parastatals that we have managing all manner of small things and displacing private sector from some things that private sector could do, in my view, affects our efficiency. So we need a second round, or what we call a second generation of reforms, largely competition-driven and market reforms to allow Kenya's private sector to expand. And we'll see that 5% head towards the 10% that we require.
All right, thank you so much for sharing with us your insights tonight. Kwame Owino, the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Well, moving on, coffee was one